I am the founder and CEO of Top Flight Defense Incorporated. And today we are here with Michelle Langlos from the VA, representative of the Suicide Prevention Program. And she will be discussing the VA S.A.V.E training. All right, Michelle, without further ado, go right ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michelle, and I'm one of the suicide prevention coordinators at Jesse Brown VA in Chicago. And we're going to talk about VA S.A.V.E training. So everything that we're going to talk about today is, and we're going to talk about VA S.A.V.E training. Sorry, my PowerPoint's not moving. There we are. Everything we're going to talk about today is geared towards veterans, but everything is applicable to anybody that might be struggling with thoughts of suicide or who might be in crisis. Before we begin, we know that talking about suicide can be a very sensitive topic. So if you need to step away from the computer temporarily, please do so. We want to always let you know that we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is listed here. But as of July, you can actually just dial 988 to get to that same number. Just like you would do 911 for a medical emergency, you can dial 988, which is a lot easier to remember if you're in a mental health crisis. So let's get started. So we're going to talk about facts about veteran suicide, common myths and realities. We're going to talk about Operation S.A.V.E and resources that you can use yourself or refer to a veteran that would be helpful for anybody who might be in a suicidal crisis. And then our objectives today is you will be having a general understanding of the scope of veteran suicide in the United States, how to identify a veteran or an individual who might be at risk for suicide, and know what to do when somebody is at risk. So normally we ask a question to the audience, if this was live, what is your biggest questions around suicide and talking about with people in crises? And some of the questions frequently that I get is, what do I say to somebody if they're having thoughts of suicide? How do I recognize somebody who might be in crises? What do I do if they say yes? And so these are some common responses that I get when we ask this question. And we're going to cover all of that in this presentation. So let's start about talking about facts about veteran suicide. So we know that suicide is a national public health issue. We're seeing an incline or a rise in veteran suicide, but also a rise within our civilian population as well. So the nation as a whole is having an increase in suicide rates through the years. And we know that when there's a suicide, that's about 135 individuals are affected by that suicide. So that could be, of course, family and close friends, but that could be coworkers, people who used to work with that individual, neighbors, people in their church or synagogue. It can be lots of different people that get affected by somebody who dies of suicide. So it really has an impact, not just on that individual, but the society at large. And so a lot of times there's a misunderstanding about suicide. People think it's, you can pinpoint the reason why someone might die of suicide. Well, they just broke up with their girlfriend, or they just lost their job, and so that's what led to the suicide. But the reality is a lot of people break up with their significant others or lose employment, and they don't die of suicide. And so it is actually a lot more complex than people realize. And there's no form or thing that we can do in order to truly assess and predict who might die of suicide. So what we try to do is we look at risk factors. What's making this person more at risk to die of suicide? And when we look at those, we want to reduce those. We want to target those risk factors to eliminate them and reduce them so that protects that individual. Then we also want to look at what protects that person from dying of suicide. So one question that I frequently ask if I come across a veteran who might have thoughts of suicide, and maybe they've had them for a period of time, and I'll say, you've been struggling with these thoughts for a couple of weeks now. Have you done anything to try to hurt yourself? And the response might be no. And my question is, what's prevented you? And that gives me that protective factor. What's making them want to live? Oh, I have a daughter I have to raise, or, I want to I want to finish college, or, I have this goal to go to Paris someday and I still really like to achieve that. So whatever it might be, that we want to build on those protective factors, those things that are protecting people from dying of suicide. And so our goal is to maximize the risk factor or the protective factors and reduce the risk factors. So these are some risk factors and protective factors. There is many more that's not listed on here, but in general, there's some themes here that we're going to go over. And so I want you to notice certain things on the risk factors. So think of a major loss for somebody. And the major loss might be something to the effect of they lost a relationship. So that might be to divorce, that might be to death. It could be separation. We know that during COVID, a lot of people's mental health was not so great. And part of that was being isolated from the people that they, normally get support and are connected with. So that lack of connection and that isolation and that loss of a loved one can really trigger people to start having thoughts of suicide. We also see a loss of employment. So when someone loses their job, it can make them more vulnerable, or they then lose their financial security. So maybe they no longer have much money in order for savings, that gets dwindled. Maybe now their housing is at risk. Their ownership of their car is at risk, which might prevent them from finding another job. So you can see how that can spiral. And so again, loss of housing, loss of employment, loss of financial stability, loss of a loved one. Also a lot with legal issues that can be looked at as almost loss of freedom. And so legal issues can be very, very triggering for people. And so one theme here that you might look at, if somebody is going through a major loss in their life, and that person's having a really difficult time coping with that crisis, that's somebody to pay attention to. Some other things I want to point out here is mental health issues. So people with unstable mental health can have an increase in suicide. So diagnoses like depression, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress, a lot of times those can be treated and they can be relatively stable. But I'm talking about the folks who either are not getting treated and their symptoms are really difficult to manage, or maybe they are getting treatment, but it's still having a hard time managing those symptoms. When it's not stable, that can really develop some thoughts of suicide and kind of have that risk involved when their mental health is not at a good place. Also think about substances. So substance abuse is relatively, there's a strong correlation between substance use and suicide. So think about it. When you're using drugs and alcohol, a lot of times people are pretty impulsive. So there's that impulsivity that makes you more at risk for suicide. You're not really thinking, you're more impulsive, and then you might do something very lethal to yourself. Sometimes when you're using things like alcohol and cocaine, that can actually make you more and more depressed because they're depressants. People can lose a lot if their substance use gets out of control. Some people will use drugs and alcohol to kind of self-medicate, but then sometimes they lose relationships over it. They could lose their job. So we're going back to all those losses again. So you can see how vulnerable people can be when their substance use starts getting really out of control. So, pay attention to folks with those kinds of things going on in their life. And then a couple I'd like to point out here that I think is really important is access to lethal means is very important. If you have a firearm in your home, your chance of suicide goes up significantly compared to people who do not have a firearm in their home. And we're going to talk about why that is. So just having access to lethal means, specifically a firearm, really increases your risk significantly towards suicide. And then the one on top I want to talk about is a prior suicide attempt. So that is your biggest risk factor. So if you know somebody who maybe made a suicide attempt in the past, but now they're in another crisis, maybe it was many years ago, but they're in another crisis right now, that person's way more vulnerable to actually die of suicide than somebody who might not have that history. Now, the reason why they think veterans are higher risk is kind of tied into that. So there is a researcher by the name of Dr. Thomas Joyner. Dr. Joyner is one of the leading researchers for suicide prevention. And he is consulted with the Department of Defense, with the VA, and what can we do to really reduce veteran suicide? And within his theory, he believes people have to have what he calls an acquired ability in order to overrule the survival instinct in us as humans, in order to do something harmful enough for us to die. So our survival instinct is stronger than our desire to die. But certain folks are a little bit more vulnerable to that. So it's very difficult to override that desire, our survival instinct. So there's a lot of mechanisms in our body to save ourselves. If we make a suicide attempt, you take an overdose, your body will vomit, you cut yourself, your blood will clot or it will hurt, so you stop. But there's also a part of our brain, that's the survival instinct, that will kick in and change your mind. And so it is very common for somebody who's very serious in the middle of a suicide attempt and stops themselves and says, what am I doing? I don't want to die, or, let me get help instead, because that survival instinct is really, really super strong. And so certain folks, like people who make a suicide attempt before, if they were able to override that survival instinct to some degree before, the next time might be a little bit easier for them to override it to the point that they actually do something lethal. Now, how this ties into veteran suicide is veterans are trained to do drill after drill after drill after drill, so that they can do things automatically and do it well and do their mission. And so if you see something in a combat situation, you see the civilians running one way and the veterans going into a very dangerous situation. So the military is very, very good at training folks who serve in the military to kind of override that survival instinct so that they can go and do their job, knowing that they're risking their lives or risking injury. And so because of that, because just their training alone wears that survival instinct down to some degree, they are able to override that and do something more lethal than maybe a civilian person would, just because of their training. So other professions that would fall under that would be police officers, firefighters. I worked in a level 1 trauma center for 12 years. I saw a lot of death and trauma, way more so than most social workers I've ever worked with. And you get comfortable with that. And so if I was in crisis, I'd be higher risk based on my exposure to trauma. And so certain professions are a bit higher risk. And that's one reason they think that veterans might be a little bit higher risk than the civilian population. And then again, people with a history of a prior suicide attempt, that's your highest risk factor. So definitely pay attention if you know that's their history and you know that they're going through something right now. Some protective factors to think about. These, again, remember, these are the things that you want to build up, and those risk factors we want to reduce. So for example, with substance abuse, let's get that person into treatment for that. If they have access to lethal means, let's see what the veteran might want to do to secure their weapon during that time of crisis. Maybe they have some relation issues, so maybe getting some couple counseling. So that's how you would address those risk factors. So the protective factors we want to build on. So certain things that people frequently will say protects them during that time of crisis is access to mental health care. So they're willing, or they already have access to mental health care, and even though they're struggling, being able to, have those appointments and those sessions with that mental health provider can help them safely get out of that crisis. A sense of connectedness is super important. I can't emphasize this enough. Being connected to other people really does protect us. And so if that person, even though they're in a really bad crisis, they're having their family and friends rally around them and check in with them, even send them a text, hey, I'm thinking about you. It might not seem like a lot, but that actually really can protect people from suicide. And they've done research on this. Problem solving. So if you're somebody who can problem solve pretty well, your solution to deal with your problem as suicide might, you're able to see other solutions. Not just suicide as the only solution. And that's really important, because when people are impaired like this, when they're in crisis, your ability to problem solve is really, really difficult. So if you already have poor problem solving skills and now you're in crisis and now you're already impaired because of the emotional pain is not allowing you to really think well, that's really going to put you in a bad situation. But if you have some pretty good problem solving skills and you say, well, I feel this way, but I see this and this as other solutions, that can really protect you. I work with a veteran currently who is pretty vulnerable, and he continuously says, well, I think there's more I can do with treatment. I believe that I'm not going to always feel this way. And he's tried lots of different kinds of treatment, and he's still really struggling, but his problem solving and his access to mental health care, I think, has kept him safe so far. And of course, the connectedness and support from family, friends, and from healthcare providers. A sense of spirituality also can really protect people. So if you're a pretty religious person, you don't believe that suicide is appropriate. Maybe you feel it's sinful. Maybe you feel you'll go to hell based on your religious beliefs. That can really protect people. And so that spirituality, praying, just feeling that you have that support from a higher power can help. So a sense of spirituality, having a sense of a mission or purpose. So we had a veteran who spoke during a suicide prevention conference, and he said the one thing that really helped with the suicide was finally having a sense of purpose. So when he came out of the service, he had this important job in the service. He knew what he was doing. Everything was pretty well organized for him. He comes to civilian life, and none of that's going on. He doesn't really have a sense of purpose. And so he's struggling with that. But once he got that sense of purpose, his suicide improved. I had a veteran who was really depressed. He was high risk for suicide. He went to school. He had family, but even though he had family support, he still couldn't see them as support, even though they were there, because he was so depressed. And the one thing that really got him out of that state, and he was doing treatment, none of that stuff really got him out of that state until he had a sense of purpose with an organization called Team Rubicon, which is kind of like a Red Cross. It's a veteran-run organization to do those kinds of rescue kinds of support that a Red Cross unit would do. And he started volunteering, and they offered him a full-time job. And he truly got that sense of mission and purpose back. And that really, really did help with his mood and his suicidality. Having a physical health, being employed, having your basic needs met. Like I said, when you don't have your basic needs met, that makes you very vulnerable. But when you do, and you're going into a crisis, that will protect you some. So let's talk about a little bit some of the data. We just had data come out about a week ago. I can't talk about that quite yet because I don't know it real well, but I'll kind of add to that. So we have had 399 fewer veterans who died from suicide in 2019 than in 2018. So we saw a dip in suicide. So you can see how this continuously kind of goes up, this graph, and then we saw a dip. The good news is, and I don't know the exact numbers, we've had over 300 additional fewer suicides in from 2019 to 2020, I want to say is the numbers that just came out. So that's really good news to see that it's continuously declining, kind of a large, in large numbers. So from 2018 to 2019, the adjusted suicide rate decreased among veterans and exceeded by 4 times the non-veteran population decrease. So the non-veteran population was 1.8, and the veteran population, my picture's in the way, but I want to say it's 7.2 or something to that effect. So there was a significantly larger decrease in veteran suicide rates than it was in the civilian population, which is good to see that there is some decline in that's the veteran suicide rate. And then this was good news as well. We've been really watching our female veterans. We've been very concerned because they've had this ongoing steady increase in suicide. And we've had 2019, there was nearly a 13% one-year unadjusted rate decrease for female veterans, which represents the largest decrease for female veterans in 17 years. So we're seeing the trends go down, which is really, really good to see. However, well, that's for male veterans and female vets, but as you can see, the veteran suicide rate is still a bit higher than the civilian population. So we're going to talk about lethal means safety. So lethal means safety, more or less what we're doing is trying to put some time and space between something that's lethal, that's laying around someone's house, more or less, if they're in a suicidal crisis. The reason we do that is because crises are short-lived. Everybody on this call Everybody on Facebook has probably been in a crisis, and at the time it feels really, really horrible. But when we get out of that crisis, we can look back at that at a very different lens. And a lot of times we do feel better. So the reality is, but when you're in that crisis, it just feels really horrible. And we want to get people safely through that crisis until they feel safe again and they can, get the resources that they need. But that's really difficult to get people safely through a crisis if they have lethal things in their home that can harm them during that time. So it's really important to kind of have those conversations with folks. And a big one is firearms and medications. What the VA is doing is we give away free firearm locks. So if you need a firearm lock and you got a firearm at home, you can let somebody in suicide prevention know. Or most of the clinics actually have firearm locks there, no matter where you're going, in order to safely give those to veterans all over the hospital system. No questions asked. We don't need to know anything about your weapon. We just want to make sure it's secure. Veterans that I work with, I have discussions, and when you're feeling this way, what can we do with your weapon? What do you want to do with your weapon? A lot of veterans get really creative. They might give them to a family member who can lock them up at their house. They might have a pretty good locking system in their home where they can have their significant other change the combination to the lock until they feel better, so that if there's an intruder, they can still get a firearm out, but they can't have easy access to it. People have actually froze their keys in a bowl of water, so if they live alone, so that if they want to use the firearm, they have to thaw out that key. And again, remember, a lot of times our survival instincts will kick in. And so that can really have enough time for people to change their mind and stop that suicide attempt. Lots of times we just gave around about a bunch of lock boxes out. We encourage people to put pictures of the reasons they want to live in there, like their kids or their future plans, so that if they ever do grab that firearm and they're feeling in crisis, they can see why they don't really want to use that firearm and remind themselves. So there's a lot of things that we do. We've also asked a lot of veterans, we've done focus groups on this, should we as providers of the VA have these conversations with people? And 80% said that we should. And so if there's firearms and somebody you're concerned is home, make sure they're at least separated from their ammunition, is locked up separate from their firearm. And again, there's lots of different creative things our veterans come up with what to do so they stay safe when they're in that state of crisis. So this is the reason we push this. There's been some research done on this, and they have shown that 24% of people will make a decision to make a suicide attempt less than 5 minutes. So it's very, very short period of time. 48% less than 20 minutes and 71% within an hour. We know that sometimes people will say to me, well, if you take out the firearm, someone's just going to use something else. Well, the research doesn't always support that. Most people will not come up with a plan B. So just removing or securing the firearm or the medication, whatever it may be, it really can protect somebody. A lot of people don't come up with another plan. Remember, people aren't thinking really well at those times. The other thing is that if you do use a firearm, there's about an 85 to 90% chance of dying in that suicide attempt. But if you look at the other pyramid, I'm not sure if you can all see it, but it's about a 5% chance of all other means combined. So if you did complete a suicide attempt with anything else outside of firearm, there's a high probability that you would survive, and then you could finally get the care you need and the help through that crisis, and you can live your full life. We know that about 90% of folks who do make a suicide attempt never go on to die by suicide. So there's lots that we can do. We just have to get people safely through that crisis. And the reason we bring this up is because for our veteran population, it's about 70% of veterans will use a firearm in a suicide, comparative to about approximately 50%. I think it's last data was about 48% for the rest of the population, but that fluctuates around 50% every year. And so significantly higher for our veteran population. And so that's why we have these conversations with our veterans to see what the veterans' plan is while they're in crisis. And that's anybody too. Think about this, anybody in your home as well. So you might be fine, but somebody in your home is struggling with substance use, or their mental health is not very good right now. Maybe they just had a major loss in their life. Make sure that firearm in the home is secure. And again, we give out free gun locks. We actually have some long lock boxes right now. We have some smaller boxes you can lock up ammunition. Those you'd have to get from suicide prevention. And they are at Hines as well, and at Level VA if you go to those VAs as well. So definitely we want to make sure it's easy. No questions asked. We just want to get locking mechanisms out there for our veterans. So again, just to stress, suicide is absolutely preventable. And we're going to talk about some misinformation real quickly. So people who talk about suicide are just seeking attention. That is false. That's a myth. No matter how casually or jokingly said, suicide threats should never be ignored. It may indicate serious suicidal feelings. And so when people are joking or making these kinds of statements, pay attention to that. Those people are might be joking to you, but they might be very, very serious, and they're saying it in a joking way. There's a lot of stigma, and we want to make sure that you take that very seriously. Most people who die of suicide do give some kinds of clues, and so those are definitely clues. So take it very serious if you hear someone making jokes or talking casually about suicide or death, especially if you know they're going through something. The only one who can help is someone in mental health or a counselor or therapist. Again, that's a myth. Remember, just that connectedness, just reaching out to somebody, providing some support, getting them to care. That really is huge and significant. A lot of our veterans come in with other veterans. They're going to trust you before they're going to trust me or anybody in mental health care here. So all those things are power that you have in order to save a life. And so we're going to talk about Operation S.A.V.E. So Operation S.A.V.E. stands for Signs of Suicidal Thinking. Ask the question being, are you having thoughts of suicide? Are you having any thoughts of wanting to hurt yourself? Those kinds of questions. B is to validate the veteran's experience. So I can't emphasize this enough. People feel this way for very real reasons. So sometimes I think it's uncomfortable for us. We want to kind of minimize the reasons, talk people out of it. But the reality is people are in a lot of emotional pain at that time, and the reasons are very valid. And so we want to validate the veteran's experience. And then encourage treatment and expedite care. We want to get people into care, and we want to get people into care quickly. Again, we know that suicide is preventable, and there's a lot that we can do to help. So these would be the red flags. These would be the things to look for, because the reality is a lot of people don't talk about suicide. There's a lot of stigma around suicide. And so there's just not a lot of open, comfortable conversation around this. So again, I'm thrilled that I'm here so I can have this conversation and open this up. But a lot of feedback I get from people is they might know someone who died from suicide, and they initially didn't think there was anything that warned them. They just didn't see this coming. And then we'll go over these parts in the presentation, and they'll say, wow, this and this was going on with that, but I didn't know that was something to look for. And so these are those red flags to pay attention to, because most people probably are not going to approach you and tell you they're having thoughts of suicide. But you can pay attention to their behaviors and other things that are going to give you clues that this person might be somebody struggling with thoughts of suicide, but they're not telling anybody. And so the things to look for: people talking about feeling hopeless. There's no way out. There's nothing that I can do to improve it. There's no future. This kind of finality. There's nothing's ever going to get better. I'm never going to meet anybody else anymore. My life is over without this person. I'll never find another job. I'm going to be destitute and homeless, and my life is over. I'm going to go to jail because I got in a fight and the police arrested me. That was an actual one, where this veteran thought he was going to go to get a felony because he got in a fight. Came back from Iraq, he got in a fight. They got a ticket. It was actually a misdemeanor, but he thought it was a felony. And so he thought his life was over, that final way of thinking, this hopelessness. And he made a very serious suicide attempt. He was not connected with the VA at the time. When the community hospital reached out, and we got him connected into care. But that was kind of his trigger. It was this concern he was going to have this felony. Couldn't problem solve out of that. We got him in veterans court. We did a whole bunch of stuff, but he was very, very hopeless. And that was his line of thinking because of that interaction with the police. So look at people who are talking about feeling hopeless. People will talk very openly about this. People also will talk a lot about feeling like a burden. That's not on here, but that's actually a really big risk factor. So I'm a burden to my family and friends. I can't stop using, or I'm a burden to my friends. I'm having a really hard time since I came back out of the military and they have to deal with me. I can't hold a job, whatever it might be. But this sense of burdensomeness is actually a pretty significant risk factor, and people will openly talk about feeling that way. So you hear somebody who's feeling like a burden, pay attention to that person. Another thing to look for is people who have really exaggerated mood. So you'll see here we have anxiety, agitation, mood swings, rage, anger. It's hard to remember all those things. So what I would encourage you to do is notice if their mood is very different than normal, and if it's pretty heightened. So they might be an anxious person, but the anxiety is off the charts. They may be somebody who is a pretty stable person with their mood, but their mood is all over the place. You're seeing really significant changes in their mood. If it's anger, if it's anxiety, whatever it might be, that's not how they normally are. Pay attention to that increase, that intensity of their mood. Another thing is there is a direct correlation between sleep and suicide. So somebody who's really struggling with insomnia. It's really severe. They haven't slept at all in a few days. Believe it or not, that's actually a medical emergency. If that was a patient I was talking to or veteran I was talking to, I would tell them to possibly go to the ER if they literally did not sleep for 3 days. So because it's really detrimental to your mental health. And even if there's nothing else going on with this person but severe insomnia, there is a correlation between sleep and suicide. The next thing I want to talk about is increase in risky activities. So as I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to actually end your own life because your survival instinct's really, really strong. So what people might do is do really dangerous things in order to kind of accidentally die. So driving really erratically, putting themselves in really dangerous situations. We had a veteran who went into a neighborhood where there was a lot of shootings going on to accidentally get shot, provoking police officers to accidentally get shot, using drugs and alcohol in really risky ways, playing with a firearm. Have a lot of veterans who will play with their firearms. Russian roulette, holding it to their head or their mouth. These kind of practicing behaviors are very concerning. Misusing prescription medicines, like they took 10 Ambien because they couldn't sleep. You might ask them, well, were you trying to die of suicide? They say no. And then you kind of talk about the lethality of what they did. Like, did you realize that could kill you? And most of the time my answer is this: yes, but I didn't care. So you'll see people doing really dangerous kinds of things. Those people are really at risk. Even if they deny suicide, they're doing very dangerous things that they could accidentally die. And those people definitely need to get in some help right away. And then the last thing on this list is withdrawing from family and friends. This is a big one. Remember that sense of connectedness to others is so important. So if you see somebody struggling, they lost their job maybe, and they're not coming around anymore, they're not responding to your texts, they're not, going to your meetings or whatever it was that they used to do, that person is of concern. Isolating, pushing away family and friends. So you could have a social support network, but if you're feeling bad enough, you could push folks away, and that makes you very vulnerable. So don't just assume because people have family and friends that that's going to protect them, because if someone's bad enough, they can push away and make themselves very vulnerable. So pay attention to that isolating person. And then these are very specific, very serious signs of suicidal thinking. These are folks who are going to tell you straight out they're having thoughts of suicide. They're looking for ways to die. We see veterans who do this on Google, talking more about death or dying. So there's more of a conversation about it. I have a veteran who tells me that he gets more suicidal when he starts telling jokes about death. People might not think it's anything because they're jokes, but to him, that's indicating he's escalating into suicidal thoughts. And then the self-destructive behavior. These people really need to be seen right away. So we want you to ask that question. Are you having any thoughts of suicide? Are you having any thoughts of killing yourself? Very direct. Now, sometimes that's uncomfortable. There's going to be anxiety when you ask this question. And so I encourage you to definitely ask it directly and not like this. you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? Because if you ask it in that manner, a lot of times it's kind of judgy. And then again, most of my vets that I talk to are petrified to tell people when they're suicidal because they're afraid people are going to judge them and think they're crazy. Crazy is the word that they use time and time again, not myself. And so more or less, we want to ask it directly so it's not judgy. And then also you're kind of giving them, I want you to say no. And so we want you to ask it directly, not in this kind of roundabout way. You're going to get more of an honest answer. We can get that veteran help that they need. And then while you're doing that, we want you to validate the veteran's experience. So what that means is, again, like I mentioned earlier, is it's just empathy. It's just acknowledging the really difficult situation they're in. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I can't imagine going through this, through this divorce like you are. This has got to be so horrible. I'm just so sorry. It's just empathy and acknowledging the pain and the bad situation that they're in. Don't pass judgment, and then reassure the veteran that there's help out there. And the reality is there really is. There's quite a bit of help out here. So when you do ask this question, again, you're going to probably be anxious, but try to remain calm. People say, what do I say? If they say, yes, I'm having suicidal thoughts, what do I say to them? So what I encourage people to do, this might be the first time someone tells anyone, so they might just say a whole ton of stuff. And that's okay. Just listen and listen for that person. And if they aren't talking very much, that's okay too. Just stay with that person. But we want you to stay with that person and get them to where they need to go, or get them connected to the help that they need to go to. Don't argue. That sounds kind of self-explanatory, but this is how I would view that. That'd be like, what would that do to your 5-year-old? What would your mother, that would kill your mother if you did something like that. That's arguing with them. It's going to go a lot better. It's like, I'm so sorry you're going through this. I can't imagine how difficult the situation is. More of that empathy and validating will work a lot better. If you're on the phone with somebody, stay on the line, try to talk to somebody else or get a hold of somebody else to call 911 if you need to do that, or definitely or try to get the veteran to maybe come down to get immediate assistance. But if they can't, definitely, and you really think they might harm themselves, I encourage you to, contact somebody through your phone as you're talking to that person to maybe call 911 on your behalf, but stay on that line until we know that veteran's safe. You can also try to get the Veterans Crisis Line involved. We have many people who will call. They don't know how to manage this, understandably, and they will call with the veteran to the crisis line, and the crisis line can take over there then and make sure that that veteran's safe and do what they need to do to keep them safe. And so I want to go over real quickly through some resources. As I mentioned earlier, the Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, which is for the whole country, was that 800-273-8255 number. We also use that same number for the Veterans Crisis Line if people didn't realize that. The only difference is you press 1 to get to the VA side. So civilians just dial that number, and then veterans dial the same number, it goes to press 1. Now, since July, they changed that to make it super easy for people to remember, and it's 988. Like 911 is 988 for mental health crises, and then for the veterans, you just press 1 to get to the VA side. So it's the same number. Both numbers will still work, but it's a faster, easier way to remember in case it's a state of crisis. A couple things that people get confused about with the crisis line is if they're not suicidal. I've had veterans say, oh, Michelle, I wasn't suicidal, so I didn't call. This is a crisis line, not just a suicide hotline. We want our veterans to call prior to it getting so bad that the suicidal thoughts then develop. We want to stop that crisis and address it as soon as possible. And it can be any kind of crisis, not just mental health. We've had financial crises, housing crises, relationship problems. They want couples therapy. They have issues with their claims. But that's really stressing them out. They have nightmares in the middle of the night, and they need help kind of de-escalating and calming down. People use it for lots of different reasons. So definitely make sure that the veterans and you talk to know that they can use it for any kind of crisis. And then the other concern we have is if I call, they're going to send the police to my house. And that's a concern for a lot of people, understandably. So as you can see the numbers here, this is about a year old, so they're higher now, but we've had almost 6 million contacts through the crisis line, because you can text, you can instant message, and you can make a phone call. And only about 204,000 times did they call EMS. So they, called 911. The only times they do that is if the veteran requests, and believe it or not, a lot of times the veterans will request, or the veteran adamantly says they will not stay safe. And so we have to make sure that those veterans are safe. But a lot of veterans who call who are suicidal, they come up with safety plans. They come up with plans for the veterans to bring themselves to the ER if they need to do that. They will have us, suicide prevention, follow up the next business day. As you can see below, that 1 million referrals, that's to my team. And then we reach out to that veteran and we make sure we get them whatever resources they need locally to help with that crisis. So it's a really good system. So I'd encourage you to give out that number. And then this is another really good resource for veterans. Again, a lot of veterans are going to listen to other vets, not necessarily somebody from the VA. And so these are veterans who tell their story about how they struggled and how they recovered. And so the veterans can put in a filter. I'm a female veteran who served in the Army, and I did one tour in Iraq, and I deal with sleep issues and anger. And they can put all that in there, and it can pull up all those videos that have those same characteristics. So you can hear from other veterans and see what they did in order to help with care. We also have some really good resources and suggestions when it comes to safe storage with lethal means during a time of crisis. That's here. And then we also have, the VA does a whole ton of apps. We have apps for sleep. A lot of our vets have issues with sleep. We have PTSD coach. We have mindfulness apps. These are all free. And so these all can help with just your mental health and support that are really, really wonderful apps. And then if there's a veteran that you know of that's struggling and you really want them to get into some treatment, you think it'd be really helpful, but they're adamantly against it, this is a consultation line that friends and family can call to try to see what you can do to kind of work together to maybe get that veteran into treatment and get them the help that they need. All righty. Any questions?
Yes, I have one or two. One of the questions I have is, do you feel that more homeless people commit suicide than veterans that are in a home?
Yes. Homelessness is actually a really big risk factor, and they have a significantly higher suicide rate than people who are housed. And the VA has pretty robust housing resources compared to the civilian resources, to be quite honest. And they're even, adding more like all the time. So our homeless program is massive. And part of the reason I think is because they do have such a higher risk of suicide. Yeah.
So I don't know if the VA does it or not, but aren't they hard to reach though, or hard to react with, or to let them know that, hey, we have help for you, we're there for you?
We have outreach people who actually go in the community to try to find veterans. So we have lots of different parts of our program, but we do have people who actually drive around to areas where there might be a lot of people living in tents or under viaducts or what have you. They will go to those locations. Actually, they'll go to the Pacific Garden Mission and look for veterans who might be staying there to try to see what we can proactively get them into housing. So we do have people who go in the community to try to locate those veterans.
Great, okay.
I know in Georgia, there's a organization that actually goes out and count homeless people, period. Not just veterans, but people homeless altogether. So not just the veterans. And I don't think that they do that here in Illinois, that they go out and count how many they are. And then with this organization, they pack up wellness kits, so to speak. They'll put towels in and different things like that. I know last year, my nonprofit organization, we went out on Cicero right off of 94th under the viaduct. And we had the wipes. There were body wipes that you can get that already have the soap in it and it's already moist. We do towels, toothbrushes, toothpaste. What I've often told people was with the water, because a lot of the restaurants don't allow homeless people in there. So giving them more than just, the small bottle of water to drink, a lot of them will need the larger bottle of water to brush their teeth because they can't get it in there. And I know that's on a whole nother subject, but I was just saying that, yes, the homelessness, as you were saying, that is a large capacity because they don't have anywhere to go. So in taking their life, they feel like that's the easiest way out.
Yeah, for Illinois does do that count. I want to say it's usually in January, and they partner with different organizations all over the city. I don't know if they do it all over the state, but I know they do it in Chicago, or maybe it's even Cook County, because I know we have volunteers at our VA who does that because it's like all night long. The Jesse Brown VA has one of the largest homeless programs in the country.
Wow.
Yeah. So we're really trying to tackle homelessness here in Chicago, at least for the veteran population.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and I know there's an organization, K9s for Veterans. They have another organization called the Forgotten Warrior Memorial. It's out in Shanahan. And for the Illinois veterans who have taken their life, they have a memorial for them broken up by the branches. And then the family can submit the veteran's name and their information, and their name will be engraved on the back of it's like it's not a tombstone. I don't want to call it a tombstone. It's a large memorial wall. We call it the wall. And they have a ceremony for them. I think it's every quarter. I know I go and sing the national anthem for them. So, and they just had one this past Saturday. So that's a good organization. I think we need to put out there as well, even though we're working towards taking that number down from 22 a day to 0, if at all possible. But there is a place that will memorialize those veterans because of the sacrifices that they made. And the memorial's out in Shanahan, and it's a beautiful memorial. And there's a place, there's like 3 benches where a family member can just go there and sit down and think about their loved ones.
Yes. So the 22 number is actually not the accurate number anymore. And so the most accurate number that we have with the data is about 17 right now. 17 veterans die by suicide. But you're right. Our goal is to get to 0 suicide. Yep. That is our ultimate goal.
Yep. If we can get it down, and with what you're doing with the VA, having these trainings is excellent. I know with the, I'm part of a coalition, and for some teenagers in the district where I grew up. And it's for those individuals, those teenagers that have taken their lives. And we're working on some things. We're collaborating with one another and trying to get together. Well, I won't say try. We are getting together, coming up with different programs and different activities that we can do with the surviving teenagers in that local area to give them reasons to want to live, because there's so much going on. And I know this is just for veterans, but with my organization, I have to open it up to all because this is happening to everyone. Our main focus is veterans, but we can take this information that you are providing us and put it into the civilian sector with the S.A.V.E, with the S.A.V.E, and asking questions and how to ask the questions and how to approach them when you're dealing with someone that is contemplating taking their life.
One thing I would like to add, that if you are considered a veteran who needs care, and this is at Jesse Brown and also at Hines, should be at Level as well, is you don't have to call and try to get an appointment. Like, it definitely, if they're maybe in immediate care, you think of the emergency room, but it might be somebody who's struggling. Maybe they don't need to necessarily go in the hospital, and you don't have to actually call and try to organize an appointment and get all that stuff. And you can just have that person come as a walk-in. They do not need an appointment to see a mental health provider, which is very difficult outside of VA, because a lot of times you might see an intake worker, and that's about done. At the VA, you'll see an intake worker, of course, but you'll also see a psychiatrist if you need to. If meds are something you're interested in, you can start it on meds. So we have it all in one-stop shop immediately. If it's after hours, they can be seen in the emergency room by our psychiatry resident. Even if it's not acute, they still can see them and do the intake and get them started and get them connected with care. So there's really no barriers with somebody that's coming into the VA for care. They can be seen immediately.
Well, thank you for that, Michelle. All right, I don't see any questions on Facebook Live. And before we get into anything more personal, if someone wants to say something personal, I'm going to, don't go anywhere, Michelle. I'm going to say thank you to everyone on Facebook that came on. I appreciate all of the people that are watching. Continue to watch. Top Flight is doing amazing things with the help of the VA, Social Security Administration, BMO Harris Bank. We have a lot of different organizations that want to come out and do virtual classes on the health and wellness of all women. And sometimes we have men that chime in, and hey, there are some things that's going on with men as well. But as we know, Top Flight is created by a woman veteran for all women. So I thank you, Facebook. And I'm going to come off of Facebook and I'm going to stop the recording.